In 1971, deep in the freezing waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, a U.S. Navy submarine slipped 400 feet underwater, straight into Soviet territory. Nobody back home knew the details. Not Congress, not most of the Navy. Not even the president was briefed on exactly what was happening down there. If this submarine was discovered, there would be no cover story that made sense. This wasn't a training exercise. It wasn't a routine patrol. And if the Soviets caught them in the act, there was a real chance this wouldn't just be a diplomatic incident. It could have been the spark that dragged two nuclear superpowers into war. Set up the Cold War standoff. To understand why this mission even existed, you have to understand where the world stood in the early 1970s. The Cold War wasn't being fought with soldiers charging across battlefields anymore. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had stockpiled enough nuclear weapons to end civilization several times over, which meant an actual war was, in theory, unthinkable. So the real war had shifted somewhere quieter, somewhere almost invisible. It was a war fought with information. Whoever knew what the other side was planning, their troop movements, their submarine patrols, their next move, had the real advantage. And by 1971, the U.S. Navy believed they'd found a way to listen in on a conversation the Soviets never intended anyone to hear. The discovery. It started, almost unbelievably, with a hunch. A Navy intelligence officer was studying maps of the Sea of Okhotsk, a heavily guarded stretch of water near a major Soviet submarine base, and he noticed something. There had to be a communication cable down there, a physical line connecting that naval base to the mainland, letting commanders send orders and reports without ever using radio signals that could be intercepted from the air or by satellite. Underwater cables like this were considered untouchable. The logic was simple. Nobody has the ability to reach the ocean floor, tap a line, and get away with it undetected. Because of that assumption, the Soviets never bothered encrypting what traveled through it. Why encrypt something nobody could ever physically access? That assumption was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The planning. The mission fell to a submarine called the USS Halibut, a vessel that had already been secretly modified for exactly this kind of operation. Extra rooms had been added for divers, specialized equipment for working in extreme depth and complete darkness. Even the crew selected for this mission had been read into a level of secrecy most of them had never experienced before. Some of them didn't know the full scope of what they were doing until they were already at sea. The plan itself sounded almost too simple to work and almost too dangerous to attempt. Navy divers would leave the submarine, descend into total darkness at depths that could kill an untrained diver in minutes, locate this cable purely through careful search along the seafloor, and then attach a specially designed listening device directly onto it. No cutting the cable, no visible damage, nothing that would ever hint to a Soviet patrol that someone had been there. If they left even the smallest trace, the entire operation, years of planning, would be exposed instantly. The operation Whitehorn, tension build. When the Halibut finally reached the target zone, it anchored on the seafloor, disguised as best as physically possible in enemy waters. Divers went out in teams, working in freezing, pitch-black conditions, where visibility sometimes dropped to almost nothing. They ran their hands along the seabed, searching by feel as much as by sight, fighting currents and cold that could disorient even experienced Navy divers within minutes. And this wasn't a one-time visit. Every single dive carried the same risk. A Soviet patrol boat passing overhead at the wrong moment. A sonar sweep catching something it shouldn't. One mistake, one shadow in the wrong place, and there would be no walking this back. This wouldn't look like an accident. It would look exactly like what it was, an act of espionage inside Soviet territorial waters. And depending on how it was interpreted, it could have been treated as an act of war. Eventually, the divers succeeded. The listening device, roughly the size of a small vehicle, was secured onto the cable without ever breaking its physical line. It didn't need to intercept a signal wirelessly. It recorded directly from the cable's unencrypted transmissions, capturing raw, uncoded Soviet military communications. Then the Halibut slipped back out, undetected, leaving behind a device that would sit on that seafloor, quietly listening, for years. The retrieval missions. Here's what makes this operation even more remarkable. It wasn't a one-and-done mission. Roughly every few months, a submarine, sometimes the Halibut, later other vessels, would return to that same stretch of ocean floor. Divers would descend again, retrieve the recorded tapes, replace them with fresh ones, and disappear back into open water. Each retrieval carried the exact same risk as the original mission. Nothing about this got safer with repetition. If anything, the odds of discovery only grew with every trip back. For nearly a decade, this rotation continued. American intelligence agencies were sitting on an enormous, continuous stream of raw Soviet naval communications, information Cold War analysts could only have dreamed of a decade earlier. The Betrayal. But operations built entirely on secrecy have exactly one weakness: people. In 1980, an NSA analyst named Ronald Pelton, drowning in personal debt, walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered to sell what he knew. Among the secrets he handed over was the existence of this exact operation. His price? Just $35,000. An entire decade of intelligence, an operation involving multiple submarines, hundreds of high-risk dives, and years of careful planning, traded away for a number that wouldn't even cover a modest car today. Almost immediately after, a Soviet vessel arrived at that same location and retrieved the device. The operation that had run undetected for nearly 10 years was over in an instant. Not because of a diving accident, not because of a patrol boat catching them in the act, but because of a single person walking through the wrong door. The legacy Pelton was eventually caught and convicted of espionage, but by the time the device was pulled from the seafloor, the damage, or really, from the American perspective, the win, had already been banked. Ivy Bells had already delivered years of uninterrupted, high-value intelligence that shaped how the U.S. understood Soviet naval operations throughout the late Cold War. Think about what actually happened here. A handful of divers working in freezing, pitch-black water at extreme depth inside enemy territory, using nothing but careful hands and specialized equipment, had quietly outmaneuvered an entire superpower's communication network for almost a decade without ever being caught in the act. Outro and Ivy Bells is just one operation out of dozens that stayed buried in classified files for decades before ever becoming public. Some of them are even more unbelievable than this one, including a mission where a simple technical error nearly convinced the Soviet military that a nuclear attack was already underway. If you want to see that story next, hit subscribe now, because what happened next could have ended everything.